Well, I would like to say muchas gracias to Domingo, and I would also like to say especially to, as well to his colleagues, including Dr. Feenstra, who made possible my visit to Castellón for the third time in my life, and I'm very pleased to be back. I wanted, señoras y señoras, I wanted to speak about the subject of silencio, silence, and democracy. And what I'm going to say, what I'm going to say is, if I can read my notes, what I'm going to say is, was written not with Spain in mind, and so I am hoping that you will see the relevance for this reflection on the subject of silence and democracy. I want to begin with some examples of what I'm going to speak about. You may know that the Danish Parliament has just been in the process of approving the largest infrastructure project in Europe. This is a picture of Denmark and Germany, and you may know that there is, as part of this project, which you can't see now, I'm not sure what we should do. We need the lights halfway between. Okay, so we have to wait for the... Yeah. That's a little better. Okay. All right. So I go back. Okay, good. That's fine. Gracias. Let me start again. I want to begin with some examples of the problem that I want to speak about. And the first example is you may know that the largest infrastructure project in Europe, in the history of Europe, will soon begin, and it involves developing a tunnel across the Baltic Sea, joining for the first time Denmark and Germany. The idea, this is some artist and architect's vision of what the tunnel looks like. Notice the birds here. You will see that this is a very major structure. The purpose of it is to link together Denmark, Germany, and Scandinavia with the Polish market, to produce a very large internal market at a cost of something like 5 billion euros. There is another example. We jump to China. You will see here an example of a bridge which is 35 kilometers long, which will effectively link Hong Kong and Macau to the mainland of China. It's a breathtaking project, and it is said by the Chinese perhaps to be the world's largest infrastructure project. Notice that the bridge is in the design of a boat. From my own country, Australia, to take another example of a large infrastructure project, this is the largest mine in Australia, where gold and other minerals are dug on a 24-hour basis, 7 days a week, largely for export and mainly to China and the rest of the Asia-Pacific region. There are many examples of these so-called mega projects. That's what I want to call them tonight, mega projects. And I want to suggest to you as an opening idea that we have entered the age of mega projects. That is, we are living in times when there are many of these projects that are now part of our daily lives. What are mega projects? They cover various areas. For example, railway networks. For example, opera houses. For example, airports and airport extensions. They include oil and gas developments, mining. They also include banks and credit institutions, experiments, in other words, large-scale experiments with new products and new processes. They include projects that usually cost at least $1 billion US dollars. That is the technical definition of a mega project. And what is interesting is that they are not capitalist, purely capitalist innovations. Typically, mega projects, whether they are in China or Europe or elsewhere, are products of state and market cooperation. That is, companies are involved with governments, and there is a kind of partnership process in their design and their building. These mega projects are very large, one could say, adventures of power. They are examples of what you could call poder arbitrario, that is, arbitrary power, large enclaves of power that are typically not subject to parliamentary scrutiny, that are not subject to citizens' control or representation. These mega projects have positive and negative effects. Mega projects create large numbers of jobs. They produce increases of wealth of any particular country or region. They are involved in the development of scientific technical know-how. Some of these projects make our lives easier. One example would be the invention of the internet by ARPA, the American Defense Organization. The invention of the internet is an example of a very major mega project which has had, of course, global consequences. Some mega projects make some people very rich. If you were to ask Senor Calatrava, you will find that he will perhaps agree that mega projects bring lots of money, and this is true for owners and managers and shareholders. Some people, thanks to mega projects, become mega rich. But this is only half the story, because what I want to suggest to you tonight is that there are two kinds of consequences of mega projects that should worry us, and which I think you will see at the end of this talk you know much about in the Spanish context. Two consequences. One is that these mega projects happen outside of election cycles and parties and elections and parliaments. They are examples of poder arbitrario. These are enclaves of power that are not subject to any democratic control. So that in the very heartlands of democracy develop institutions, areas of power that are not subject to any democratic control or representation at all. The other consequence is typically on the biosphere. That is to say, there are environmental consequences to many of these mega projects that are beginning to be visible in various parts of the world. Now, you might ask, what is so unusual about these mega projects? I want to suggest to you that the scale of these projects means that they affect the lives typically of many hundreds of thousands or many millions of people. And also, because the footprint of these mega projects is very large, they have large environmental consequences of an unprecedented way, in an unprecedented way. We could put it like this. Once upon a time, most people on the face of the earth lived in smaller communities. And when things went wrong, the consequences were restricted to the local area. If things went very wrong, they could move from that local area to another locale. By contrast, mega projects take us into a world where large exercises of power, if they have damaging consequences, have damaging consequences for very large numbers of people and for very large areas of the planet. Mega projects are examples, as I say, of arbitrary power, and one could speak about them. You may not know his work. Jan Patočka was one of the great Czech philosophers of the 20th century who used the term Titanism. Titanism, referring to the Titans and their attempt to steal the power of the gods. Mega projects are, in other words, examples of Titanism, bold adventures, big thinking, big attempts to transform the lives of people, to transform the environments in which these mega projects are embedded. Now, what I bring to you, señoras y señoras, is not very good news. But you know this from the Spanish context. Mega projects sometimes go wrong. Things happen that have damaging consequences. They do not take us into a world of paradise, let's say. Let's give some examples. Here is an airport. It is the Hong Kong airport, Cheklapkok. It was, for its time, one of the world's largest airports. It cost so much money that it actually bankrupted Hong Kong for nearly 10 years. Or let's take the example of London's Olympic Games. The projected cost of the London Olympics 2012 was £2.37 billion. The actual cost, it now looks, will be around 24 billion. That is to say, a 10-time increase of the costs of this mega project. Or I take the Opera House in the city in which I live. It is at least as beautiful as the one in Valencia, but you may know that it was more than 10 years late, and the cost increase was 1,400%, 1,400% greater than the original costs. And if we move to the Spanish context, you know very well that the Spanish cajas, a big, bold experiment in generating a large construction industry that affected virtually every Spanish community, that the cajas system, protected by regional governments, actually has had very damaging consequences for the whole of the Spanish economy and many of your lives. The collapse of the cajas, I am informed, left behind a debt of around 100 million euros of bad debt. It led to the collapse of Bankia, the conglomerate of banks. It left the government of Valencia, the regional government, I am told, in debt to around 25 billion euros. And this morning I calculated, this is the very bad news that I bring, that if the population of the Valencia region is around 8 million, then each one of you tonight is in debt to 312.5 million euros. Each one of you owes 312 million euros. Now, I'm not sure if you can pay this tonight, but probably I think the good news is that you can't ever pay this. It's an absurd sum of money. But this is the kind of consequence that mega projects, large-scale adventures of power can have when they fail. And you know it's a serious matter. 300,000 of your young people who graduated from university have left Spain since the crisis began. You know that half of your under-25s are out of work. And you know that maybe 1.5 million people or more have to decide each week whether they will eat or whether they will pay their bills. This is the kind of consequences that you are presently experiencing. It's not only costs, and it's not only delays of mega projects, but it's also that things go wrong during the design and the construction and the operation of mega projects. An American sociologist, Charles Perrow, famously referred to normal accidents. Accidents are normal in many of these large-scale adventures of power. And that is why you will know I forgot to show you this picture of an airport, I understand, that is nearby. I was hoping that I could fly to Castellón, but no such luck. You will know that when accidents happen in some of these mega projects, there are disastrous consequences, and these have become household names around the world. Bhopal, the gas and chemical leak in India, which is not over. The nuclear meltdown at Chernobyl. This is an image from Chernobyl. The wrecking of oil tankers, Exxon Valdez, and so on. Disasters of this kind are growing in number. And I put to you the thought tonight that we are entering the age of mega projects, but we are also entering the age where mega projects go wrong, and these have very serious consequences for our lives, for our politics, for our future generations. The question I want to ask you is why? Why do they go wrong? Why do mega projects typically cost much more than they are said to cost? Why do they often take much longer to build? Berlin's Brandenburg Airport, where I am now living at the moment, is at least 2 years overdue, and maybe it will be 3 or 4 years late, and the cost will have risen enormously. Why do things go wrong? Why the normal accidents? There are scholars who propose that one of the reasons why these mega projects go wrong is because men are typically in charge. Think about it. Robert Trivers is an evolutionary biologist who proposes that we human beings have a natural capacity to deceive ourselves. And this is why we don't recognize the dangers and risks. I suggest to you that single explanations of this kind are not very convincing. There are many reasons why mega projects go wrong. For example, simple miscalculations by people who work within these organizations. There is the famous example at 3 Mile Island power plant in the United States. It was the last nuclear power plant to be built. The famous example of an inspection that was done to check some valves, and there was a small sign placed over the valves saying checked. The trouble is that the small sign covered a red warning light, which was not noticed by the engineers, and that led within 11 seconds to a near meltdown of the whole plant. I mean, it was a misjudgment, a miscalculation by those who worked within it. We know that there are cases where mega projects don't have built into them any awareness of risk. We know that poor leadership, the irresponsibility that comes from very complex decisions also play a part. We know that lying happens. That is to say, those in charge of these mega projects tell lies. And the very good example of this is, and for next time, this is the warning in Spain and in other contexts. When someone proposes a big project and says it will cost 100 million euros, then suppose normally that that is not true. And that hard questions should be asked. Lying is one of the causes, no doubt, of these failures of mega projects. And there are also unintended consequences, chain reactions. These are all part of the reasons. But I want to put to you a thesis tonight, an idea, a basic thought. This is what political thinkers are supposed to do, and that is what I'm going to do to you. I want to put to you the idea that there is one central cause of the failure of mega projects, and it is the privatization of power. To put it differently, those who are in charge of these mega projects suppose that they can be governed in silence, silencio. That is, what they try to do is to protect those in charge of imagining, designing, building, operating mega projects, try to protect the power relationships from public scrutiny, from monitoring, public monitoring. They suppose that public relations can take care of the rest. One of the paradoxes of these mega projects is that they typically come wrapped with lots of media coverage. There is something like a permanent campaign to convince the public and to convince people inside these organizations that everything is all right. So it's a great paradox that institutions of power, large-scale power, come to be wrapped in public relations, and the effect is to produce a kind of silence, a public silence about them. Nobody asks any questions inside the organization or outside the organization. Some anthropologists refer to this strange process as the Rashomon effect. I don't know if you ever saw this film by Kurosawa. It is a famous Kurosawa film called Rashomon, where something happens where many people are speaking about other things, but nothing is said about the real crime that happens within the film, the Rashomon effect. So I want to suggest to you that the root cause of the failures of these mega projects is that they are governed in silence, that they depend upon, many of them depend upon, the cultivation, the production of public silence. And the consequences are pretty clear and pretty decisive. One of the consequences is that those who are in charge at various levels of these mega projects suffer a kind of blindness. Could I say ceguera? A kind of willful blindness that means that they don't pay attention to potential problems. There is built in to these organizations strange customs. For example, lots of mental shortcuts are taken. This is an idea of Daniel Kahneman, a psychologist, which I think is very important. And when you look at the leadership of these mega projects, some of them are led by people who do not allow any criticism outside the organization or the mega project or inside. And the famous case is, I don't know whether you were ever introduced to him, is Dick Fuld. Dick Fuld was the CEO of Lehman Brothers. It was one of the oldest banks in the United States. It collapsed, as you know, and it triggered an Atlantic crisis, or it helped to trigger an Atlantic crisis in the banking and credit sector. Dick Fuld is famous because he ruled Lehman Brothers like a tyrant. Everybody was afraid of him, and he had very limited contact with his employees. For those of you who are involved in organizations, here is how you do it. Every morning, Dick Fuld would travel from his home by a chauffeur limousine, picked up by a helicopter, taken to central Manhattan, where a chauffeured limousine would pick him up and take him to the Lehman Brothers offices, where there was an automated system where the front doors of Lehman Brothers would open as he arrived, and the elevator doors would open. Nobody was there. He would travel then to his office and sit at his desk and not see one Lehman Brother employee, because he didn't like to have interaction with them and expected no criticism, only loyalty. This is one of the consequences of this is one of the symptoms of this silence that can have ruinous effects within mega projects. The consequence is that troublemakers, people who want to blow a whistle, people who want to criticize what goes on within the organization become scared, or they lose their courage. They don't do it. And the consequence is that anybody working within these organizations knows that things are not completely right, that there are things that are wrong, but they don't speak out, and they take the view, it's a kind of irresponsibility. They take the view that it is someone else's job to deal with this problem. All of this happens in a context where journalists protect the mega project. This is quite typical. I ask you, what do journalists do around the ha-has? I mean, did they report critically how regional governments and the banks operated? Usually what happens in these mega projects is that a few journalists, trusted journalists, are allowed access to the organization, and they report positively what the organization, the mega project is doing, but they do not criticize anything. That is typical for many of these mega projects. The consequences, we now know, this is, by the way, Rupert Murdoch, famous for making phone calls from New York to London and staying on the telephone with his editors and turning silent. And you don't dare hang up. He asks you why it is that you published this, or why did you choose that headline, and you are expected to answer. It's a very frightening experience when Rupert Murdoch called. This is not a good way to manage or lead an organization, but this is how mega projects that go wrong are so often organized. We know that when these mega projects go wrong, they can go terribly wrong. This is Deepwater Horizon. If you look at the origins of why this blowout happened in the Gulf of Mexico, it's British Petroleum's adventure of power. If you look at the reason why it happened, it's very clear. This drilling was supposed to be regulated by a federal government institution called the Minerals Management Service. It turns out that the relationship between the regulator and the project was a very close, tight relationship. The two, the regulators and those who managed this rig, went on golfing trips, they went on holidays together, they did drugs together, they slept together. Very often, there are many recorded cases, we now know after the inquiries, there are many recorded cases where the helicopter comes from the government, from the federal government agency, it lands on the rig, and a form is filled out, but it's filled out not by the federal regulator, but by, in fact, the BP officials. So they fill out the safety checks, and then they go off and they have a drink or lunch or whatever, and they fly back to the mainland. And the consequence is pretty serious. This was an accident, a normal accident that happened because the rules for drilling in very deep water were simply set aside. So what the federal government did, the Minerals Management Service, was only apply shallow water rules to this deep water drilling. And this is a very dangerous and risky process, but there was no blowing of whistles, there was no criticism of this. Now, what I'm suggesting to you is that there is a problem of silencio. There's a problem of silence as you sit in silence. There is a problem of silence because these mega projects, when they go wrong, are typically mega projects that come wrapped in, they are protected by public silence. Now, I want to say a few words about silence, beginning with a very famous quotation from Ortega y Gasset, one of your famous philosophers from the Republican period, globally famous, who himself was interested in silence. And as I understand the translation, what Ortega says here is that whenever communication happens among people, there is always silence. That communication between people supposes silence. What is very strange, I think, is that in the field of politics and in reflection on politics, in political thinking, there is very little work done on the problem of silence. And in fact, we know that it is mainly in linguistics, sociolinguistics. We know in anthropology there is very good work on the subject of silence. But there is very little work done in the field of politics. And I'm trying to suggest to you tonight that we need to take seriously in democracies this problem, this question of silence. Of course, we have many proverbs, aphorisms, sayings. Reden ist Silber, Schweigen ist Gold is an old Swiss proverb. Silence is golden. You know, it's not always, but this is the kind of, we teach our children. We talk to each other about the issue of silence. We know from theologians that religion is an experience that typically requires silence. For example, think of prayers in a synagogue, the Kaddish prayers of Jews in a synagogue for those who recently departed. If you've ever been to a Quaker meeting, it's an astonishing experience where nothing happens, it seems. People gather, nothing is said. I've threatened, by the way, tonight, Domingo, that I would speak about silence by saying nothing for 1 hour. But I decided not to do this. The point is that the experience, the spiritual experience of religion, let's say, typically draws upon silence. We also know that from our children, we teach children the art of being silent. You know, we have in English this old expression, children should be seen and not heard. That children need to learn how to be silent. We know from the history books, and you know from your experience as women, that there is a very strange coding in male-dominated societies, coding of silence from the point of view of women. I never quite understood how you women do it, but women are supposed to be silent, but not silent. You need to know when you can speak and not speak, and this is quite a hard task to perform. We know as well from some political writings, Thomas Hobbes, for instance, we know that tyrannical government, autocratic government, requires the cultivation of silence among the subjects of that power. And it is often said by those political writers that silence is a good thing. Well, señoras y señoras, I suggest to you that those maxims, that those remarks about silence being golden, that silence is a good thing, don't apply to mega projects. We know that there are times in matters of politics where silence is a good thing in a democracy. For instance, when a judge enters a courtroom, everybody is expected to be silent. Or we know that when someone has died, a whole crowd of people, large numbers of people will rise and they will remain silent for 1 minute or longer. It's respectful silence. But we also know from these mega projects, I'm suggesting to you, that in fact silence can have catastrophic effects. This word catastrophe is a very strong word in Spanish and in English. It comes from the Greek originally. It means a moment where there is a sudden turn or there is an overturning of things that are taken for granted. I suggest to you that we are entering the age of mega projects. I suggest to you that these mega projects do fail, and I suggest to you that we have entered a period of history where catastrophes become normal. Catastrophes. My reflections on catastrophes and silence come from looking at three cases in the last 5 years. Lehman Brothers, Deepwater Horizon, and Fukushima. Some of these catastrophes are avoidable, there is no doubt. I do not think that catastrophes are our fate. I do not think that they are inevitable. Some philosophers, Heidegger, for example, thought there is really no alternative. We are on a pathway, and the pathway ultimately is catastrophic because our lives depend upon these mega projects, and we cannot go back to living in villages. We cannot go back to small-scale existence, and therefore our lives on Earth in the 21st century are becoming more and more filled, littered, one could say, with catastrophes. I don't believe this. I also don't think that these catastrophes are taking us back to the period that Eric Hobsbawm, the great English-Austrian historian, referred to the age of catastrophe, that is the 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s. We are not going back in time. We are experiencing something new, and this something new has much to do with these mega projects that I'm trying to describe to you. What is different about our times? Many of these catastrophes are slow motion. They happen once in a while. I wonder where the next one will be. Many of them are cumulative. That is to say, they tend to have cumulative effects. They are not products of fascism. They are not products of capitalism. They are not products of socialism. They are produced by these typically hybrid arrangements of power, governments and corporations, professions like architects, interrelated. They are different as well because they are having serious impact on our biosphere. They are also different because they become grand media events. Think about the media coverage, if you remember, of Chernobyl compared with Fukushima. Fukushima became a global media event almost instantly, and many millions of people, it's estimated that several billion people, watched images, they heard stories about this major catastrophe. All of these things are new, and so what also is new is that we have a whole media industry producing films and programs about catastrophe. One of the first, by the way, featuring Vincent Price, is called The Last Man on Earth. It was one of the first catastrophe films. A lot of money is made through the film industry by making films about catastrophes. We also know that money can be made on the bond and stock market. The Chicago Board of Trade, for example, was the first to develop catastrophe bonds. I mean, you can make money betting on catastrophes. This is new in the history of democracies. Now, you may be feeling depressed. You may be feeling melancholy or sad. And it gets worse for a few minutes before I try to suggest a way out of this. But when you analyze, when you look into the details of these catastrophes, they are really shocking. This, by the way, is a slide, an image from a play written by Samuel Beckett. It's a great play written more than 30 years ago in honor of Václav Havel. It's called Catastrophe. And in this play, which I saw, this is a woman named Billie Whitelaw, a very famous actress. In this play, the most striking thing is the silence of this play. That is, the play is about catastrophe. How do you capture catastrophe? What is it like for human beings to experience, to live through a catastrophe. And Samuel Beckett, the Irish playwright, made the point that catastrophes typically produce silence in the first instance. People fall silent. They cannot find words to describe what they are going through. And I want to just illustrate this point with reference to Fukushima. This is a recent photograph of the town closest to the Fukushima reactors, Nami. Look at the landscape, devastated by earthquake, by tsunami, and then by radiation poisoning. The people of this town will never return to this town. And what is especially shocking about the catastrophe that affected this town is that the mayor of the town was given no instructions by the authorities about how to deal with the reactor's near meltdown, and so had to lead his people away from the town into exile, so to say. This is really shocking stuff. There is, you can see some images. You know that the authorities in the early hours tried to persuade people that everything was all right. Then Japanese audiences saw on television this image of one of the reactors blowing up. There was then the testing of young and old for radiation poisoning through various parts of Japan. The first journalists, here they are, the first journalists who visited Fukushima plant were told that everything was under control. Most of them didn't believe it because, in fact, still there is the effects of this catastrophe are not by any means under control. There is no solution to the radiation problem. When you look at why the Fukushima disaster catastrophe happened, it is a textbook example of the problem of silence. This was a company, TEPCO, that was protected by a few journalists. The Japanese had a system called the Kisha system. So a few journalists lived in the plant. They were the special favored journalists of the company. And they never, ever reported, during this space of 25 years, they never reported bad news. Only positive news. Everything is all right, everything is safe, there will be there are no issues, no leaks, nothing. And it turned out, of course, as we now know, that this silence that descended on the Fukushima plants has had very disastrous consequences. Now, I want to draw this together and come to an end by asking this. If we are living in the age of mega projects which go wrong and which can have catastrophic effects, what will be the political consequences of these catastrophes? Well, we know that past catastrophes did have political effects. For instance, here is a famous painting in Lisbon of the earthquake that devastated the city of Lisbon. We know that it effectively ended the Portuguese Empire. It led to the development of new earthquake technologies, and it led to a serious questioning of the church. If God is all-powerful and if God is benevolent, how is it that God allows catastrophes of this kind? We also know that, for instance, catastrophes like the Black Death in Europe, where maybe 1 in 3 of Europeans died, led to the birth of many millenarian movements. I'm suggesting to you that we think about, in our times, the politics of catastrophes. That is, when catastrophes hit peoples and their biosphere, what are the consequences likely coming in our times? We know closer to our times that World War I, the catastrophes of World War I, led to a destruction of parliamentary democracy, It led to the rise of a politics of violence. It led to the rise of fascism, which led to the concentration camps of the middle of the 20th century, both in Stalin's Russia and Hitler's Germany. We know from World War I that the catastrophes began to undermine the belief in progress. The modernist belief in progress that the future would always be better than the present became unbelievable after the catastrophes of World War I. I suggest to you that we put serious thought to the political effects of catastrophes. And among these effects in our times, undoubtedly is a greening of politics. Here is one of Japan's most loved and famous writers, Haruki Murakami, who, reflecting recently, actually in Barcelona just last year, reflecting on Fukushima, said that one of the long-term consequences of Fukushima, of this catastrophe, was that it should make us as human beings feel that we are unwanted guests on the face of the earth. And we should live as if we are not invited guests on earth, and we should therefore have quite a different mentality and attitude towards living on the earth. I want to end by suggesting one political effect, one political consequence of mega projects and their failures and their catastrophic effects, and it has to do with the problem of silence. You all know this famous First Amendment in the American Constitution. It was one of the earliest constitutional clauses that basically says, for those of you perhaps who can't read this, it basically says that the state, that government, no government should make any laws that restrict freedom of the press, freedom of speech, freedom of communication, that citizens have the right to express themselves publicly about matters of power. What we know from our history is that there were many reasons given for why freedom of communication among citizens is a good thing. Some of these are strange reasons today. For instance, in the past, in Europe, there were times when many Christian thinkers insisted that freedom of communication was a God-given entitlement. This is the way, for example, John Milton, in the English Civil War, the great poet and writer, defended liberty of the press. God gave us reason, and we should use this so that the devil can tempt us, so that we can go beyond the devil, live good lives on earth, and hope that in the future we will live in paradise. It's a theological argument for freedom of communication. We know that there are other justifications of freedom of communication. Jeremy Bentham, utilitarian thinker and activist in the early 19th century, wrote a letter, an open letter to the Spanish people defending liberty of the press. And his argument was quite different. It didn't depend on God. His argument was that freedom of communication is important to maximize the happiness of the greatest number of people, to prevent misery. And there is some, I think, insight to this. I could go on. What I want to suggest to you as my closing thought tonight is that these catastrophes, that these mega projects are putting on the table a new justification for freedom of communication, a new justification for investigative journalism, for citizens speaking out, for resisting the silence that typically supports these large-scale adventures of power that can go wrong. You may know that some years ago, I think it was the first attempt to do so, the New York Transport Authority developed a new slogan: see something, say something. If you see something that looks strange, say something, speak out. I think this motto captures exactly the thought that I wanted to put to you tonight. There is, I'm suggesting, a new historical reason for freedom of communication, which is that freedom of communication, openness, the public scrutiny of power, democracia monitorizada, monitory democracy, the new justification for openness, for communication, for public discussion, for public inquiries into exercises of power, the new justification is that this is the best way to prevent catastrophes. To put it differently, where there is no public scrutiny of power, where there is no openness, where citizens are not involved in speaking out about matters of power, then they are asking for trouble. Things will likely go wrong. I did not mention this earlier in my talk, but there is one Danish sociologist who has done the first large-scale study of megaprojects. And the evidence that he shows is that if there is no public scrutiny mechanism built into megaprojects, then in 90% of cases, something will go wrong. And an example is the Cajas in Spain. There were no independent public scrutiny mechanisms built into this banking and credit system, and it is not surprising, seen from his point of view, that things went wrong because of a kind of stupidity, a kind of folly, a kind of arrogance of power that did not anticipate that things would go wrong. So I suggest to you a new precautionary view of freedom of communication, a new historical reason for why freedom of communication in a democracy is not only desirable but necessary. Public silence is the enemy of democracy. Large adventures of power that come wrapped in public silence, protected by journalists, are dangerous for citizens. It was Martin Luther King who famously said that our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. I agree with that very much, and it captures the spirit of what I wanted to say to you tonight. But how? What can ordinary people do? What can representatives do? What can wise experts do? Well, there are many things that can be done in this period and in the coming years, and I want to begin to end with the example that you may not know about. It's the example of the American chemist. His name is Sherry Rowland, who was the one with a partner in laboratory who discovered that CFC gases are likely the cause of the ozone layer that is very dangerous for the Earth. The story is told, he died recently, the story is told that one night he came home from his laboratory and his wife asked him, "How was today, Sherry?" He said, "It was a normal day." What happened? Well, probably we now have evidence that these CFC gases in spray cans are likely the cause of the ozone layer. Otherwise, it was a normal day. His wife instantly became angry. She collected in the house every product that had a spray can, and she threw them all out, and shouting that this was completely absurd. And it was, according to the obituaries of Sherry Rowland, who died recently, it was the moment where he decided that he would go into action. It was that experience, with his wife angry, blowing up like a volcano, that made him realize that this was a public matter and that he should do something about it. And as you know, One of the consequences of that moment was the Montreal Protocol that banned these CFC gases. Things can be done. There are many examples of institutional innovations. British Petroleum, after this Deepwater Horizon catastrophe, have now instituted Monday morning town hall meetings. All the staff, together with management, meet in an open town hall on a Monday morning to discuss things within the company. Or if you take a company like Électricité de France, it's one of the world's largest energy producers. It has a policy of full media disclosure. If things go wrong, they tell journalists that things are not going well, that something has happened. They don't lie. They try not to cover up. There is a famous Dutch German company called C&A, C&A, which has for many years operated a policy of openness. They even have a special unit of the company that has the power to prosecute other parts of the company if there is corruption within the company. We know that there are now organizations, for example, in Oxford, that are recommending that all public projects should have what they call pulse checks periodically. There should be reviews constantly of the design, the construction, and the implementation of any mega project. And they point out that unless this scrutiny happens, then these projects will go wrong. It may be that citizens, too, will have to get involved in and are already involved in the public scrutiny of power. There are many examples of this, and one of them comes from Fukushima, where you may now know one of the consequences of Fukushima is the development in Japan of a national network of citizens whose job is to criticize future nuclear plants, but also to monitor radiation levels. And as of 1 year ago, there is now a mobile phone application which allows citizens to actually measure radiation in food or near children or in schools or in any situation because they don't trust the government. Well, I think I should end. I said enough about the problem of poder arbitrário. Arbitrary power, power that is wrapped in silence, power of a large scale of the kind I've been describing is a problem for democracy. It is potentially destructive of democracy, and so the need for speaking out, making noise, lots of noise, what the Greeks called parrhesia, bold speech, the willingness to speak out publicly, using any means possible to prevent the abuse of power that leads, I suggest to you, señoras y señoras, to catastrophes of the kind that I've spoken about tonight. I wanted to say muchas gracias for your attention. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, profesor Keane. Tenemos tiempo para preguntas. Podemos hacerlas también en español y aquí Ramón y Elsa, ¿no?, podrán traducirlas, o sea que como usted prefiera.
Maybe there is just silencio, but there is a question. Yeah,
yes?
Well, first of all, thank you for your speech. It was very interesting. Then I would like to know, have you heard about Eurovegas?
Eurovegas.
It's a kind of small Las Vegas that this American millionaire called Donald Allison or something like that want to build in Madrid province. So I would like to know if you have heard about.
Tell me more, please. Tell us all more.
Mega project.
Levántate.
Sí, sí, se oye mal aquí, sí.
No.
It's a kind of, as I told you, small Las Vegas that this.
Small Las Vegas.
Yeah,
It's pretty big.
It's a very big mega project, so and it's supposed to be really, really bad for the local economy. Politicians, they are trying to sell that mega project as really only the good, positive things. And I would like to know if you have any opinion of this Euromega. If you don't know the project,
No, I mean the first question to ask, and it comes from my talk tonight, the first question to ask is, are there any public monitoring, scrutiny processes built in? And if then this is a very major problem.
It smells the same as all the big projects that we have
Yeah.
already here. The new corruption is already born in this project.
Then the evidence from Bent Fleeberg is his name, the Danish public policy expert. The evidence is that in 90% of cases, this project will run over budget, it will be delayed, and there will be negative consequences for people or the biosphere.
But the fact is that at least in Spain they are taking people hopes of work because there are a lot of employment there.
Sure.
So they are promising things that they cannot for sure, they won't be able to do in the future. But people is expecting this mega project that it was a kind of salvation or something. So, and it shocks to me a lot. I can't understand how people can expect something good of this, as Las Vegas is not working in the United States. That's why he's trying to do it here.
Oh, the great danger is estupidez. And I think you say. And it's also a great danger to have a kind of fatalism, that as citizens or elected representatives, there is nothing that can be done. But if I am right, seen historically, these large mega projects are beginning to be normal. They are part of our lives in the 21st century. And we should pay attention to them, and we should become more discriminating. We should become wiser. Some of them should not happen. That's for sure. They should not happen. But this is a matter of politics. And above all, it's important to see that this is not our fate. I don't know how to say this in Spanish. I can say it in German, but I mean, that somehow God decided that this is our future. Destino. There needs to be a change of attitude. And, well, some Spanish people certainly have made this change of attitude in the last several years. Because you are suffering. You are suffering effects of the collapse of mega projects, as are the British, as are the Japanese. And you know that this is not just an Atlantic problem. This is a global problem. One of the very striking things, I have a rising interest in the politics of China, is that politics in China is very often about these mega projects. I mean, there are battles being fought on the internet and in particular locations about these big projects. Because this is the future of China as well, or one future of China, these mega projects that structure people's lives, and they can have very damaging effects. I'm sorry that I can't give you detailed advice, but the problem is clear.
Thanks very much, first of all, for your lecture. Voy a preguntarle en inglés acerca de las causas del silencio. I want to ask you about which is the basis or the causes of this silence. It's different in China, where there's no democracy, but here in Spain, at least. What do you think about the connection between silence, irresponsibility, transference, temporary transference of power, whatever, concepts that are linked with our democratic tradition?
It's a great question, and I will shock you by saying that these mega projects in actually existing democracies have many Chinese characteristics. That is, the way they are introduced, the way they're designed and built and operate in silence is how it happens in China. And I'm not sure if this was clear, but these mega projects typically take a long time to build. And so they are not synchronized with elections. And they operate outside the mechanisms of representative electoral democracy. And that means that politicians either know nothing about them, they're ignorant, or politicians are deeply involved because they have an interest financially and politically. That's what happened in Spain, I think, with Cajas. And how does it happen in a democracy that silence can descend, as we say in English, on a whole enclave of power? Well, journalists and media are very important for ensuring that happens. It happens because there are faithful journalists who have special admission rights. They're given holidays, they're given privileged access, and they write nice stories about these projects. This is not a conspiracy, this is how it happens. I met, for part of this research, the former public relations manager of the largest mining company in the world. He told me that this largest mining company, BHP, had at most 20 journalists globally, friendly journalists, and they only give information to those journalists and nobody else. And these journalists know that if they write a bad story about the company, then they are out. So the journalists have an interest in remaining loyal or faithful. This is how it happens. He called them plane spotters. A plane spotter is someone who spends their time watching planes take off and land. And they report this. This is not a very nice expression in English. To call a journalist a plane spotter means that they don't use their brains, they don't use their critical faculties, they don't investigate the power relations. But this is how it happens. Plus lots of advertising, lots of nice advertising. Probably the advertising began for this casino complex. And the Cajas certainly had a whole advertising campaign. And special offers. I understand in Spain that sometimes if you went to a Caja for a loan, they give you other things.
Yes,
A bit of extra money for a holiday.
Yeah.
It's a good idea. Except that it produces bankruptcy and now imposed austerity, the enforced attempt to change your life. This is serious business. So it is a great paradox. But the suggestion here is that there are damaging anti-democratic consequences to these mega projects. And in this sense, they take us in the direction of the Chinese experiment with power. Don't think of China as here and democracies here. I mean, there are many overlaps, and this is one of them. I showed you this picture of this Pearl bridge. The way that it's managed and implemented is identical to the way that Deepwater Horizon or Lehman Brothers operated, or let's say Fukushima. It's the same kind of top-down management, discouragement of criticism, no encouragement for bad news to to be publicized. Only good news. Oh, I made everybody unhappy. I don't think, to repeat, I don't think that we are going back in time. This is not somehow a regression to the early 20th century. I think there's something new about these, and we should try to understand them.
And the phenomenon of the citizen journalism, how you say this phenomenon? I mean, this is not, many times it's not professionalism and it's not follow the rules of journalism, but many times it's like making the picture on the news that the journalism is not able to show us. What is your impression on that?
Yes, and I mean you have a flourishing citizen journalism networks in Spain, and these are very important for keeping alive the spirit of this democracia monitorizada. I mean, keeping alive this spirit of public scrutiny. A small example, in my own country, thanks to citizen journalists, we now know that the Americans are using Australian bases for launching drone attacks on Pakistan. I mean, it was sort of amazing. The government knew, the Ministry of Defense knew, but it didn't say anything. It's top secret. But I think that, you know, without becoming romantic, independent citizens, investigative journalism is really important in this age, and because it can reveal things that were previously secret. It can break the silence. And you don't have to be a fan of Julian Assange. We Australians specialize in causing trouble, by the way. Little country, once a colony, and now, you know, interested in freedom of information. Yeah, we are. There is a very healthy spirit of this, but you know, it's everything from the Julian Assange phenomenon. You know, WikiLeaks. It's very brave and dangerous work, through to a small citizens' initiative in a local town that is worried about pollution or worried about the impact of this mega project on people's lives. This is very important. And my hope would be that through time, it takes time, there is a rebirth of investigative journalism among the really important quality newspapers, El País, New York Times, Guardian, and so on. And my hope is, it's the long-run hope, that citizens learn that we are now living in these dangerous times of mega projects. And my really long-term hope is that politicians and parties come to play a much more, let's say, representative role in these matters. One of the problems that you can see globally is that elected representatives are part of the problem. They are part of the problem when judged in terms of these mega projects. They usually profit or benefit, or they remain utterly silent about these mega projects. This is clear, for instance, with Fukushima. From the 1950s, Japanese scientists warned that American-style reactors, not designed for earthquakes, should not be introduced to Japan. The politicians put this aside, and then for 50 years, basically every government, it was usually only one government, protected that nuclear industry, so that no bad news could ever be published, so that when something went wrong, as it did, the main cause of the catastrophe was not the earthquake or the tsunami, it is what happened next. It was the failure to prevent and the failure to act quickly and intelligently. You may know that as a symptom of this, that when the catastrophe broke in Fukushima, the CEO, the head manager, locked himself in his office for 5 nights and 6 days. He didn't speak to anybody. He had a nervous breakdown, wondering what he could do. I mean, this is a disaster. This is the real cause of the deepening catastrophe. So, a renewal of politics in all senses is, I suppose, one of the messages for tonight. How you do that is very hard. But that depends upon you, and it depends upon elected representatives, I think. It depends on cultivating as well a different kind of management within organizations. I mean, I live and work in a university where there is an open management system. If something is wrong, people say it. And that's how it should be for any large-scale organization, and particularly these mega projects, because if something goes wrong, it has catastrophic consequences. So blindness, fear, anxiety, being afraid to speak out, these are really bad qualities. These are negative qualities. The virtues are openness, the willingness to speak out, the boldness. What the Greeks, it's a term that we can't translate into modern European languages, parrhesia. Yeah. Parrhesia. It doesn't mean freedom of speech in our sense. It means bold, courageous speech for the sake of the public good. This is what Greek Democrats, this is the word that they use, parrhesia. It's not our modern understanding exactly of freedom of speech. You know, I have the right to say anything I like. It's parrhesia is bold, risky speech where you can lose everything. You can lose your reputation, you can lose your job, but you do this because something is wrong and you think that the public should be protected, that the common good should be protected. Democracies need this parrhesia. They need this old Greek virtue. And my anxiety, my fear, when you look at these mega projects, is you have many, many examples where there is none of this, not even one voice. This is bad for democracy. But this, as Spanish citizens, you know. You know.
Did you study in your study how they protect in developing mega projects, how they protect themselves against criticism?
The first thing they do is they always underestimate the cost. They say this will cost 200 million. In fact, as Ben Fleabag shows, it will usually cost 2,000 million. And why do they do that? Because if they said, sorry, but it's going to cost 2,000 million, nobody would accept it. So they lie. I mean, it's called strategic miscalculation in public policy. It's a wonderful phrase, strategic miscalculation. Then, as the project begins, anything that goes wrong is protected from journalists and from public scrutiny. You don't, because if there is a disaster, a minor disaster that happens, then that can potentially wreck the whole project. Usually, it's only at the end of the project that bad news comes. An example is this Brandenburg Willy Brandt airport in Berlin. You know, it was all ready to open, and then journalists found out that the fire alarm system wasn't working. And that will lead to probably 5 or 6 times increase of the costs. Everything has to be redone, and it leads to a delay of the opening by at least 2 years, maybe more. This is really amazing. But those who are managing this in a very complex management protected their flanks, we say in English. They protected the whole project against public criticism, because they knew that if the public got involved, they would say, hey, this needs to be shut down, or we need to stop it, or we need to think again. So it's very paradoxical, but this is how it happens. But it begins usually with, well, we say in English, may I say this word, bullshit. And you have to see that,
Promising progress. No?
of course, jobs, it will add to the local economy, it will only cost this amount of euros. Did any economist in Spain calculate the long-term costs of the collapse of Bankia and the cajas? No, I mean, not only the debt, but the consequences measured in the impact on people's lives. How would you measure the cost of this? So if at the beginning a government announced that it's going to cost 1,000 zillion euros to have this cajas system, and with regional governments involved and building airports and so on, that it will cost 1,000 trillion, would anybody be in favor of this? No. So this is, I mean, one of the first things to be clear about. And if someone proposes a new, are there any projects in Castellón being proposed?
We have.
No money left. Anyway, when the next one comes, this is the first.
No? The language city, no? The language city. We have 2 or 3 projects more projects.
There was a question.
Sonia?
Yeah, I think it's important, John, not only to stress that we have to speak out, but we have to think critically.
Yes.
Leaders not only speaking out, but thinking critically.
Yes.
And I think that, I mean, today, I think we can see a big loss of education in this sense. And that probably it has been a big mega project too. Dismantling critical education with many years, many decades of this specialization in education specialization. And now maybe we should have to start at what Martin Nussbaum calls de-specialization. Otherwise there is no option for educating in this critical thinking that is important to really speak out with sense, without repeating the same again and again. Because that is the discourse that has no effect at all at the end.
Yeah, I think it's a very important point. It is one of the reasons why the subject of politics is the queen of the sciences. It's one of the reasons, okay, it was a bad joke. It's one of the reasons why universities, I think, have a very important public role to play, and that education more generally has a role to play. And I agree with you very much if I think about the methods I used to develop this idea. It's very much across disciplines. I mean, in order to understand mega projects, typically you have to know some ecology, you need to know something about architecture, you need to know something about politics, you need to know something about business models. I mean, as citizens, just...
Philosophy, psychology.
And history, a sense of history is important. Yeah, I think what is needed, certainly in matters of political thinking and matters of being a public intellectual, I try to be, is you cannot stay within your discipline, because otherwise you are made ignorant. And you need to open up yourself to this range of literature and range of issues that can only be understood in a kind of more comprehensive way. This is just, for me, it's just at the beginning of rethinking these whole mega projects. But I think that something historically new is going on. That's my intuition. Something new is going on. When did it begin? I don't know. Several decades ago. And this is not, to repeat, this is not a rerun of imperial rivalries and the rise of fascist parties and the rise of dictatorships. This is something new, something more subtle, something more puzzling, something that has positive effects on people's lives. It creates jobs and so on. But it also, when they go wrong, can have very disastrous effects. And we should pay attention to these. They will not go away. There will be, it's clear to predict, it's clear that there are many, many, many mega projects that will be proposed in the coming years and decades. This is the pathway that we are on. And effectively tonight I called for a new politics of mega projects. And I think this politics of mega projects is global. It has to have a strong sense of globality. And some of these mega projects, of course, have global effects. You may know that Fukushima produced increases of radiation in all kinds of parts of the earth. There was a big jump in stillborn births in Vancouver and in Seattle. Maybe coincidental. Car filters picked up radiation, 10 days later in California, and. So some of these mega projects have global effects, and I think the near collapse of the banking and credit sector and their adventures of power, developing new products, is a very bad example of what happens when mega projects go wrong. They have global consequences. Everybody on the face of the earth feels the pinch of the collapse of Lehman Brothers and Bankia and the Royal Bank of Scotland and other organizations. This I think is the intuition we should have. We should be thinking about the power effects and the politics and the ethics of these adventures of power. And my worry is that textbooks in the university and the speeches that politicians give don't address these issues. And yet they are there. They are, we'd say in English, the elephant in the room. It's there, but nobody speaks about it. So, it's a good time to be doing that, I think. Well, I'm sorry to make you feel so unhappy, and I hope tonight you have very sweet dreams. Muchas gracias.
One question more.
All right.
Hi, thank you very much. I want to know if we break the silence about the catastrophes and Keane as well, the current capitalist state.
So the question is,
if we can break the silence about the catastrophes and as well keep the current state.
I see. Well, of course, there are many examples of mega projects that are directly to do with capitalism, with market-based corporations, sure. But there are other examples of mega projects that are more directly connected with the state. The invention and deployment of drones. Do we know this word in Spanish? Unmanned aerial aircraft. Drones. No. It's a state project. And yes, businesses profit from this, but it's driven by state power, by military calculations. And I think that these mega projects are not simply a problem of capitalism, and they are not simply a problem of state power, because typically mega projects happen because of the interdependence of corporations and government institutions. And I say this because I don't think, but maybe now I'm too old or too disaffected, but I don't think the solution is socialism. And I don't think the solution is the abolition of the state. This was a way of thinking in the 19th century and the early 20th century, but I think it doesn't meet the challenge. And I would say it's not radical enough. It's too conservative. There is something bigger and newer that requires much bolder imaginative thinking, political thinking. We need new solutions to a new problem. And I don't think that reading Das Kapital or Marx on 1848, I don't think we will find the answers to this solution. Maybe I'm wrong about this. But I learned this from Chinese colleagues who, if you ask them, so is the problem of mega projects that it's mainly a problem of capitalism? No. And they say the problem is socialism. I mean, the problem is we have this Chinese strange system of one-party rule and a kind of market. And this is the key cause of these mega projects and the disasters that are happening in the Chinese context. So I think, if I can put it like this, the problem is poder arbitrario. The problem is arbitrary power. And there is one good solution for arbitrary power, and it's democratia. That's the simple idea in my political thinking. It's very simple, I know. But somehow how to keep alive the spirit, the language, and the institutions of democracy. And I don't mean only free elections and multi-parties system and parliaments. I mean the democratia monitorizada. I mean this public scrutiny of power with teeth, where citizens and representatives don't accept what they are told, that they cause trouble. Sometimes they prevent things, disasters from happening. That is what I mean by democracy. And I think, in a way, we are living beyond the problem of capitalism and socialism. That's what I think. But that's because when I was younger, I had a lot of direct experience of the Soviet model in action. And for me, this distinction between capitalism and socialism is somehow, it belongs to that period, and we need somehow new political thinking, a new political action, I think. You are looking skeptical. That's good. That's good.
That's good.
That's good.
Muchas gracias.
Wow, that's nice. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.